Welcome back to Live Impact News. We are about to bring on Dr. Leslie Caughell from Virginia Wesleyan University. She's the Associate Professor of Political Science, the Chair of the Political Science Department, and we'll be bringing her on in just a moment. The reason we hesitate is because we want to read yet another statement we've gotten from at this point, a politician in Virginia, a politician that is running for congressional office in the midterms, and a politician who was a congresswoman for a term here, Elaine Luria, looking to represent the 2nd District and has represented the 2nd District here in Virginia, releasing a statement on this Supreme Court ruling. Let's go through this very quickly here. As I have said since day one of this campaign, I intend to win Virginia's 2nd Congressional District to end the failed policies of Jen Kiggans, President Trump, and a broken Washington that have made life unaffordable for Virginians and their families. The Virginia Supreme Court's decision today does not change that. Unlike Republican-controlled states, Virginia put the proposed maps to a vote, with nearly 1.6 million Virginians overwhelmingly supporting the referendum to level the playing field, preserve fair representation, and protect our democracy. We will continue our campaign's momentum into November to flip this seat, fight for working families, and get to work for the Virginians who are being left behind by Jen Kiggans and Donald Trump. That, again, is from Elaine Luria, who was challenging Jen Kiggans for that seat in Congress representing the 2nd District. And I will note that while this has taken the maps back to their original drawing before this redistricting began, it does not mean that the numbers will break down the same after the midterm elections. It does not guarantee a continued 6-4 advantage for Democrats. Those seats could still change based on those elections. That's a good thing to note and was alluded to by Elaine Luria in that statement. Okay, let's bring on Leslie Caughell. Leslie is always so generous with her time, and today, just such a quick response. We appreciate you joining us sort of on a whim here, Dr. Caughell. And I'll just start very broad here. Your reaction when you saw this decision from the Virginia Supreme Court?
Yeah, my reaction when I saw this decision is, on some level, I feel like, politics aside, for trust in government, this was a really maybe the worst outcome we could see. Because I think part of what this does is plays into a narrative of the courts being politicized, maybe in the sense that for Democrats or people who voted for this redistricting measure, on top of the Supreme Court case, kind of gutting what is left of the Voting Rights Act and some kind of other cases that are going to lead to the further redrawing of maps, I think you see a situation in which it's just becoming clearer and clearer to voters that the playing field is not level right now between the parties when it comes to the redrawing of the maps, right? And I think there's also a fear that you would have that people who voted for these maps are going to feel that the Supreme Court has delegitimized a kind of popular decision, which they have here, and for good reason, right? There were very real concerns that underlie this map, but they let the vote go forward. So now you have all of these people who've participated in the process who feel kind of like their votes are being thrown out, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and to your point, something we noted very early in the stream that you just reemphasized there is that this case came before the Virginia Supreme Court prior to the election happening. The Virginia Supreme Court decided to delay their decision until after the election, which led to not only 3 million Virginians going to the polls to vote, a majority of those Virginians choosing a certain outcome, and $83 million being spent on these campaigns that now is completely nullified by this decision. Did you feel like their original decision to delay their deliberations indicated that they would essentially follow the results of that vote? Was that your impression when they first did that?
I guess if you had asked me to bet money on an outcome, yeah, that would have been my guess or the impression that I got. I think, though, what this should draw our attention to is, let's assume that the court let this move forward because they weren't sure what they were going to decide and they were weighing what are very important and legitimate questions. And they didn't want to take this out of the hands of voters before an election. This is why you don't do this stuff so close to elections, right? And when we started this redrawing of the map with Texas, all of these activities are oriented around affecting these midterm elections. I think there are unintended consequences to all of these things. And I'm sure the court's not eager to be in what the Supreme Court at one point in time with regard to gerrymandering called the political thicket. They'd like to make these decisions and maybe stay out of the limelight. Uh, but politicians are kind of putting them in the middle of this because we're doing this so rapidly and so close to elections. And I know when I said I think this is the worst possible outcome, I think you're alluding to part of what I consider so bad about it. If the Supreme Court of Virginia had just said no on this vote, it's too close to the election, then there would have been people upset with the outcome. But I don't think that it's quite as bad as this outcome, which is people feel their vote has been nullified. And you mentioned the amount of money spent on this election. There was an ungodly amount of money spent on this election and time and political capital used by politicians to get this referendum forward. There were real costs incurred here, I think, both in terms of money and public trust. That, you know, our resources, I really don't think we can squander in this political moment.
And then when we look at, you mentioned the Voting Rights Act severely weakened by a Supreme Court decision that we saw come down here recently. We look at the juxtaposition of that decision, a number of southern states sort of scrambling to redraw their districts, along with what was considered to be a big win for Democrats in Virginia being nullified by the state Supreme Court. Are we now set up for a situation where, I guess I'm trying to think of how to phrase this question. How big of a win is this for Republicans when you look at these two decisions in concert with each other? And is this something that you think is meaningfully going to impact the midterms to a point where the ownership of the House will actually change based on these two decisions?
So I'm going to separate out those questions. I think this year is likely to be a wave election. And I don't know that the combination of those Voting Rights Act decisions and the redrawing of the maps is going to change the outcome of the election, which I think leans pretty strongly toward Democrats retaking the House. I would say, though, that the one thing that I do think about as we're considering this, and maybe this is the optimist way of looking at this, just in the sense of good government and maybe not wanting politicians to be choosing their voters, and that all of these gerrymandered maps are being they're being drawn based on data from 2020 and 2024, especially 2024. And politics now look a little differently than they did in 2024. I think there's a real risk that politicians are going to draw maps that they think buy them more seats, but end up weakening some of their incumbents and putting some people who didn't expect to be vulnerable in the election in tighter elections. So I do think, to the extent that there are a lot of Democrats being like, this is the end, Republicans are keeping the House, I don't think that's generally the case. I do think this is a big win for Republicans, though, because what Virginia's kind of redistricting election outcome meant was that essentially they had evened the map with the early redistricting done in places like Texas. And one of the complicating factors for Democrats here has been that, much like Virginia, some Democratic run states in the past decade or so had done a lot of good government reforms that took the power to gerrymander maps out of the hands of state legislatures or governors and kind of made the process at least maybe more bipartisan or less partisan. A lot of conservative states didn't do that. That means conservative states have a lot more room if they're going to do these mid-cycle redraws to try to carve out new maps. That doesn't necessarily mean they're going to get what they want in terms of, kind of exactly predicting where the vote's going to go. But it does mean that they have more room to quickly maneuver to the extent that we're at a race to the bottom to redraw the maps to maximize seats. But I just want to reiterate, like, if you're concerned about elections being outcomes where voters can make their preferences known, this whole process has got to leave you feeling really disgusted. Kind of this idea that The Supreme Court changes the Voting Rights Act, and immediately we have a bunch of states redrawing districts. One state, Louisiana, like essentially postponing their primary to do this, right? So, and the Supreme Court itself had shortened the window that they usually have on implementing a ruling to make this possible. So, this just doesn't make you feel great about the state of elections or democracies in the United States right now.
And what you mentioned there at the end is another interesting juxtaposition. You see in Louisiana essentially delaying the primary vote, whereas this decision comes down to almost a semantic interpretation of when an election began or didn't begin. So it's again, we see these contrasts and they're illuminating for sure. Now you did mention reasons for optimism, which I appreciate, and I'm wondering, as far as more reasons for optimism, you said you talked about how we got to sort of observe the preferences and the will of the people. Now, the impact of that has been nullified by this decision, but the data remains. Are there things that both the Republican and Democratic parties can take away from this experience that will ultimately be beneficial?
What can the Republican Democratic parties take away? I think one of the things that we can take away here is that the courts are going to be really important in laying the boundaries for these processes. If I were to say one thing about the Virginia Supreme Court decision, I've given you a lot of reasons that I feel like it undermines public trust, and there are problems then that are broader implications of that decision after letting a vote go forward. But it's also like a legitimate question to ask when an election begins, when we have early voting. This was an important question. And there's a very strong argument to be made that, if the the House is taking a vote on something after people have already started casting their ballots, the election has begun. So I do think, courts are still pretty central in this, and politicians and political parties aren't just going to get to move forward. It just kind of willy-nilly based on what they want to do. Um, the other thing I would say too, if there's something positive for Democrats, I think you kind of see it in Elaine Lauria's statement. I think it should be that reminder that you can redraw the maps, but there's only so much you can do with those boundaries if you have wave elections. And there's always the risk, for example, in places in the South like Tennessee that are redrawing their maps to endanger what are majority minority districts, that what you're going to do is upset minority populations and increase their voting turnout and ultimately kind of create what you call a dummy mander. In political science, we talk about gerrymanders that people kind of write that end up backfiring against them and costing them seats. Because of their arrogance, dummy manders. And I think you could see the possibility of this happening, right? This doesn't change how voters feel about the political moment. In fact, I'm an American political scientist, so I always am careful when I venture into kind of territory outside of that. But when you hear a lot of people who study elections and who study European politics and democratic backsliding talk about the recent vote in Hungary, in which they took a like seemingly authoritarian leader and kind of pushed him out of power through electoral mechanisms, that part of what motivated voters weren't a lot of the things that bothered, people in elite circles, like his kind of push against anti-trans, anti-gay populations, and the democratic backsliding itself. It's the appearance of corruption. Voters don't like corruption, and they don't like the sense that they're not doing well, while politicians are like taking stuff for themselves. And there's a narrative here that these redistricting activities are precisely that. Like, politicians maybe should be concerned about things like the war in Iran and gas prices. Meanwhile, we're trying to kind of carve out another Senate seat. I'm sorry, House seat in Tennessee, in a Democratic district, right? You're trying to take away one seat. So I think it doesn't necessarily look good for the party in power, the party redrawing these maps, and it really feeds into a public corruption narrative that we know is motivating toward voters.
And we always learn something when we bring Leslie Caughell on the stream. Today, that something is dummy mander. I had not heard that term before. Interesting, and I would bet something we hear more often as this kind of process continues to play out. You joined us last minute here. We really appreciate it. Is there anything else you want to add before we let you go?
No, oh, actually, yeah, I think there are a couple of races in Virginia. This is obviously going to really affect. In the Kagan's-Loria race is going to be a competitive one. It was going to be a competitive one regardless, just because of the current political environment. But this change in the map, I think, really puts that race back on our radar as one of these really competitive races where a Democrat might win, but the Republican has a much better opportunity of holding the seat. So this is exactly kind of the type of race that these new maps are aimed at, kind of stacking kind of four against one party. So this is just a really interesting one to watch. And if you're Jen Kagan's today, I have to imagine you and your campaign are feeling much better about the race, knowing that you are not running in a district that now, it comprises some of Bobby Scott's pretty traditional Democratic voters.
Okay, very good. And that's a race that we certainly will have a great amount of attention on. I'm sure we'll talk to you about it plenty as we approach November. But for the time being, we really appreciate your time today. This has been so helpful for us. And hopefully you have a great rest of your Friday and off into the weekend.
All right. Thank you so much.
And Dr. Leslie Caughell from Virginia Wesleyan, always so helpful for us, but today really last minute came on to talk about this breaking news that we learned right at about 10:15 a.m. So that is always helpful, but today especially really a benefit to our live impact news stream here.